Today in the EU, why climate NGOs are taking the EU Commission to court. Two climate NGO groups are bringing the European Commission before the European Court of Justice on two separate fronts, challenging the EU's commitment to its environmental pledges. What are the NGOs demanding, and how could these legal battles reshape the EU Green Deal? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. 2015 was an important year for the climate goals we have now. Most of them were born with the Paris Agreement,
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
Including the target to keep global warming temperatures well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. At that point already, the EU had taken the lead on climate policy, and the Union's efforts have only scaled up since.
The European Green Deal, this is Europe's man on the moon moment.
But as the EU became slowly more ambitious, activists got even louder about how the world is running out of time. And they started bringing governments to court and winning, like in Switzerland.
The court holds that under Article 8, states have a duty to adopt regulations and measures capable of mitigating future effects of climate change.
This time, it's the EU Commission that's in the crosshairs. I'm talking about these true brand new environmental cases with our Energy and Environment Hub editor, Donagh Cagney. Hi, Donagh.
Morning.
Usually, it's the European Commission that takes countries to the European Court of Justice over climate lawsuits. Around 3/4 of all climate cases have been initiated that way. This time is the other way around. Why are NGOs taking the institution to court?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, they want to win their cases, as you can imagine, which are quite specific about specific European laws or rules or practices. But really, it's a much bigger picture. And what we're talking about here is a wider trend of climate litigation, where it can be anyone, often it is individuals and NGOs, take governments of different levels to court to push them for more ambition in terms of climate action.
And when it comes to the claims that these NGOs have brought forward, how has the Commission responded so far?
So there's two cases which have come out over the last 2 days. We can go into the details of them maybe later on. The Commission has responded defensively, I guess you could say, initially, and I don't necessarily say that in a bad way. The procedures that both NGO groups have taken is that they need to do an internal petition or review or get the Commission to do its own internal review before they go via the legal framework. And in both cases, the Commission has done that review and said, this doesn't warrant further action, so we're pushing it back to the NGOs. A lot of the feedback is not actually on the substance of the NGOs' cases, but it's on the procedural basis. So the legal principle that we, the European Commission, are not obliged to act in these circumstances because very complicated legal arguments.
Mm-hmm. Let's take the cases one by one. The first is centered around the criteria included in the taxonomy framework, which allegedly compromise its environmental integrity. What is the goal behind the regulation?
The regulation is all about getting private investment into the green transition. So we all know that the vast changes that need to be made to fully decarbonize means it's not going to be public money alone. It's going to be a lot of private money. But until a few years ago, nobody could really say what is a green investment and what is not a green investment.
Right.
So the taxonomy regulation aimed to address that by coming up with a really comprehensive list of different activities and putting a label as to whether an activity is green or not.
Sounds simple.
Sounds simple, incredibly complicated because the world is complicated. You can't just divide it into two things. And one of the real contentious issues has been around so-called transition activities. Mm-hmm. And the case that's being taken by these NGOs is about shipping and aviation specifically.
Yes, aviation and shipping are the main focus of the first legal case. What is the argument exactly?
Well, the NGOs are arguing that the criteria in the taxonomy regulation, they're just too lax, essentially. So they point to analysis by Transport and Environment, another NGO, which say that 100%, so all of the Ryanair, EasyJet's and Wizz Air's order books, so 3 big low-cost carriers, they would be able to be labelled green under these conditions as well.
Wow.
Yeah, it's everything basically. They also are quite wary of greener ships, which would be running on LNG, liquefied natural gas, which absolutely is less polluting than bunker fuel at the moment. But they say that the Commission hasn't taken into account the effect that LNG can be associated with leaks of methane into the atmosphere, which is far more polluting than carbon dioxide. And they talk about lock-in effect. So we buy these big ships, these aircraft now, we're still operating them in 30, 40, 50 years when we're meant to be completely climate neutral.
Right. And how did aviation and shipping end up in the picture as, well, potentially sustainable investment in the first place?
It comes back to that transition label. I mean, it's a reality today that if you wanted to buy a carbon neutral passenger aircraft, you can't. It doesn't exist. Similarly, shipping, we're just not there yet in terms of the technology for a fully decarbonised shipping.
And where does the Commission stand in all this?
So the Commission has taken the approach that, well, if you invest in ships or aircraft that are best in class or more CO2 efficient than the predecessors, well, we can label that as sustainable. And the NGOs are not on board with that at all.
Looking at the second case instead, which is spearheaded by this NGO called Can Europe, we're talking more about the 2030 climate goals and specifically the target to reduce by 55% emissions. Where does this number come from?
It's a core part of it. I mean, this is a really systematic case. This is a case that could have much wider ramifications beyond just the issue of 55 versus 65%. What Can Europe and some other NGOs are doing is they are citing several different pieces of European legislation, including the treaty, including the Paris Agreement, including the European Charter of Fundamental Human Rights, to say that the European Commission's current and the EU's current targets to reduce CO2 emissions by 55% by 2030 versus 1990. They're saying that's not enough. And again, that's where we get into the really dense legal stuff where, lawyers will be arguing amongst themselves for years. But some of the core points that Can Europe are making is that it's not aligned with the science, that a 55% reduction by 2030 isn't going to be enough to keep us within 1.5 degrees of warming, according to the Paris Agreement. And they also say that the European Commission didn't do sufficient evaluation, like an impact assessment, that it's not science-based targets, essentially.
This is how Romain Didi, spokesperson of the environmental association Can Europe, commented on the matter.
The numbers chosen by the European Commission are not legal. What we are asking is really for the EU to redo its homework and to go back to work again on these numbers because they are not in line with environmental law.
And are there any precedents of this kind in climate litigation?
I think the most interesting point about it is the fact that they're relying on, in part, upon human rights law. And this is a trend that's really come out in climate litigation over the last couple of years. There's been many attempts, different jurisdictions, different levels, different countries, to try and really link fundamental human rights with an obligation upon countries and governments to tackle climate change, to be safe and protected and to be able to earn a living, etc., etc. Not every case has been successful, but there have been a few landmark cases that have been successful. One of them came out in April of this year, the so-called Klimatsignorinen case. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but that was a case by several Swiss older women who argued that the Swiss government's lack of ambition on climate change was endangering their future welfare, in particular because of the high temperatures that would come from climate change. It's difficult for people who were over a certain age. They went all the way through the Swiss courts. They were rejected at every level, but then they took it to the European Court of Human Rights, where they were successful.
And what significance does this have for climate mitigation cases moving forward?
And that's potentially a landmark case because European Court of Human Rights, confusingly, it's not part of the EU, but European countries are all part of it and subscribe to that treaty, so are subject to that legal order. So the ramifications there are potentially much, much greater. They could be for all the countries. They have to respect that similar ruling as well. And that's something that's going to play out over the years ahead. And what's happening now with Can Europe and the European Court of Justice is they're making reference to that case. They're making reference to human rights, and they're trying to do the trick again in a European and EU context.
We're in front of what is clearly a growing trend of activists bringing governments to court. Can we expect this shift to impact the way green policy is done?
Well, that's absolutely what NGOs are trying to do with these cases. They're looking for systematic change, like the Swiss case that came out in April.
And what do experts say about it?
The experts we've been speaking to are lawyers, so it's not like they're given simple, straightforward answers. They throw around words like it's transformative, it's fundamental, there's going to be these cascade impacts with new laws coming through.
Yes, and this is how LSE policy fellow Catherine Higham spoke about the trend.
Not only do these cases sort of lead to changes in behaviour by the government, they lead to changes in discussions in the parliament, but they also can be at the basis of cases against companies, for example.
And it is certainly the case, but it's been very hard to pin down as to what it would mean in practice if these cases are subsequently won. It also takes years to happen.
Right.
So the Can Europe case, I think they hope to have it resolved in 2 years. There's an accelerated process. 2 years is quick for these kind of cases.
Let me stop you there.
Sure.
Why is there an accelerated process?
So they put a petition in to get that accelerated case. They're arguing that they managed to get this accelerated case because, their case is so important and fundamental.
Right, clock is ticking.
Yeah.
I guess we will have to see how this goes.
Yes, it's certainly a watching brief.
Thank you, Donagh.
Thanks, Giada.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.